Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, everyone, thanks for coming. This is our last noon book review until the fall. Today's the last day of school out of Post and Kill Elementary. I just found out that Brian skipped school to be here. So, last year, Brian teaches first and second, right?
Yes.
First and second grade out of Post and Kill, and he spoke last year about Jonathan Kozel's book, Letters to a Young Teacher, and we had a really very positive response to Brian's talk, and most of the people that came up to me afterwards and the weeks that followed said, "Hey, who was that guy? Where'd you get him from?" I said, "Oh, just one of our patrons." So I was really happy that he wanted to come back and talk about a book again this year. This book's called How Lincoln Learned to Read, 12 Great Americans and the Educations That Made Them by Daniel Wolff. So here's Brian Rhode from Post and Kill Elementary School to tell us about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe, for having me back.
Sure.
Although he made me promise this time that I would let anybody in the audience tie their own shoes, I'm sorry. It's when you work with first graders, this is just something that starts to happen. But yeah, yesterday was the last day with the kids. Today, I was already out there. We had some meetings this morning for creating class lists for next year, and I'll be heading back after the talk just to do some finishing up work. But I was very pleased to be invited back, and Joe and I started talking about just some book ideas. I had a book idea, and then he gave me this title, How Lincoln Learned to Read, and I got very excited and latched onto that idea quickly because I thought, "Ooh, this is really neat." You know, education always seems to be an issue that brings a lot of debate, some controversy, and just a lot of discussion about how can we make it better. And for me, this was a novel idea. Well, why don't we go back into the past to find where we should be moving forward in the future? And without even kind of opening it up, just the title alone started to get me really excited. I thought, boy, who better than Abraham Lincoln, someone who started out learning their lessons before in front of firelight by scratching on a wooden tablet with pieces of charcoal, who then eventually ended up in Washington, D.C., and himself is now a statue made of granite and just an epitome of kind of like a self-made American and someone who is so influential in our history. Isn't that such a wonderful person to go back to gain some wisdom about where we could go in the future? And then I saw some more of this, and I thought, wow, 12 great Americans. Boy, I was saying, I'm always looking for, in my own practice, those ways that I can improve my teaching. Well, maybe this book has some of those lessons. I began to envision just this all-out slugfest between the past practice and the present practice. It would be the 3 R's versus differentiated instruction. It would be the one-room schoolhouse versus all of the grades we have now. It would be reciting lessons versus experiential learning. Well, that's not the way it turned out to be. I'd have to say some of what I got from this book was expected. Some of it wasn't. And there were some really wonderful surprises in it as well that I'll get to in the course of talking about it. But again, before I started into it, I just thought that this would be great to kind of, with hindsight always being 20/20, it would be fresh to kind of break from the modern debate and see what someone said about how such significant people were educated and made their way in our country. And then as I started to leaf through it and I saw the type of people that Daniel Wolff included, I was even more excited because these are not the stories of all dead white men, which is pretty good. Okay, I feel that I can say that because someday I'll be a dead white man myself. But I thought, as far as a history text, it drew out not only people from cultural minorities, but also women. One chapter about a Native American woman. And I thought, this is really a wonderful, eclectic group of people to get a nice cross-section of what education has been like in our country. And I brought this book home, and I was very excited. I was thrilled. You know, I cradled this book. I was so excited as I brought it home. And when I tell people about that I was doing another book talk, a lot of them, oh, that's wonderful. What are you going to do? And I said, how Lincoln learned to read. And I would often get oh, that's nice. You know, I understand this is a very specific niche, you know, education and history together. And I, as a teacher, of course, I have I'm really interested in education, but I also bring a love of history to the table as well. And so I was very excited about it. And I always think that history is a wonderful way to not only gain a depth of story to our personal experience now, but as a way for us to move forward. So I still kind of hoped that perhaps I could dive into this book and become like a modern 49er, you know, sifting through the education knowledge. Someday maybe holding up and yelling, "Eureka!" while I was reading it, and that would be it. There was the information that was going to transform my practice. And again, it didn't work out that way. But Daniel Wolff has put together a book that I think is not only informative about the educative experiences of the people he included, but also one that has created some themes about education that are really worth paying attention to. So I began to think, though, now why did he write this type of book? He's written some other books that deal with history, but actually did a little digging, and in an article for the Oregonian by Jeff Baker, he had talked to Wolff, and he had said some of the things that got me excited about the book. He said, you know, he wanted to get away from all of the debate that's being had about education policy and practice right now. And he said, let's kind of make it more simple. Let's go back to people who are very successful in this country for different reasons and significant, and find out how they learned. And not just to get a secondhand information, but he wanted to use essays, biographies, autobiographies, as much as he could. He wanted their own words about what they thought was important to learn and how they did it. And so he also created kind of a very simple thesis for it. He went to an idea by Henry Adams that simply says, how do we learn what we need to know? And that's really that's the lens that he turned on all of these stories from these people. How do we learn what we need to know? And it's very interesting what he came up with, because one of the first things that you'll see, if you choose to read this, is that from the experiences of the people who are included, what they need to know seems to be very different. He starts with Benjamin Franklin, and he ends with Elvis Presley. Now, that's another thing that really got me excited, ending with Elvis. And I thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful. And he kind of steps these figures. He uses each of them. There is some overlap. I didn't check specifically birth dates and dates that they had died, but there is some overlap within the time that they were living. But really what he does is he takes us from the time of Benjamin Franklin up until Elvis Presley. And his reasoning is, he said, by the time we get to Elvis Presley, people around that time and after him, education was for the most part the same. The formal system was set, and everybody would be getting the same type, K to 12, the college system in place, graduate school, those kinds of things. Prior to that, it wasn't as formalized, so he thought that kind of ends that part of his story. So he chose to end with Elvis Presley that way. But it was difficult to kind of, when I sat down to do this, it was a little tough to think about how will I talk about this book. Because unlike another text, it doesn't have one plot, it doesn't have one character. It's really a serial book. Each chapter stands by itself. Each chapter has a lot of depth and a lot of detail about the person that it discusses. So the commonality, though, is that question, what do they need to know and how did they learn it? And each of them learned things very differently. And what they each needed to know was equally different. As I got to the end, though, I started to notice some significant parallels that come from it. He includes a lot of various stories, and I haven't had a chance to talk to him, but it seems my impression might be perhaps for a purpose, to create some of these parallels in what people need to know. You know, there are things such as there's Ben Franklin's education that he feels should serve practical ends. Contrasted with Elvis Presley, who at the end of his formal education, really what he pursued the most was his art. There was Henry Ford, who was the industrialist, compared with Rachel Carson, who was the naturalist. There's W.E.B. Du Bois, who holds education so dear, the first African-American to receive a graduate degree from Harvard, compared with Sojourner Truth, who had absolutely no formal education at all. So these stories come together to give an impression that perhaps our modern debate of what we need to know might need to shift. Because a lot of these people, how they learned what they needed to know, that was a bit more common. And the answer was not in school. For various reasons, though, for more of the historical figures, like Ben Franklin, he had 2 years of formal schooling. 2 years, that's it. And I didn't put this together specifically, but I thought I would like to take the first 6 chapters, add up all the formal schooling that those 5 Americans had and see what it was. And my thought is that it would be less than the 12 years of formal schooling that all of our children go through now or have in the last several generations. So of course what they needed to know was gotten by other means. But I don't want to misinform. He definitely fleshes out that education is important. A lot of the people in the book, several of the figures, they speak very specifically to the importance of becoming educated. But what's interesting, again, is it's for various and very different reasons. You know, going back, you have someone like Abraham Lincoln. For him, becoming educated was the key to helping to settle not only himself, but some of society, and settling in the sense that his family was a pioneering family. And in fact, the chapter opens with an anecdote about Abraham Lincoln being shot by some Shawnees and dying in his field. That was President Lincoln's grandfather, or great-grandfather. But anyway, it was a member of his family, so a great attention getter. I'm like, wait a second, that's not the way I remember things happening at all. But what he saw the constant movement of the pioneer people. You went to one area of land, you farmed it until it couldn't be farmed anymore, and you needed to move on. And he thought education was the key to becoming a resident and letting go of that nomadic life of the pioneer. So he thought education could transform this country into something like that. Well, then you go to, before him was Andrew Jackson, who saw in his own life how you needed to have that option of more land because you didn't know who was coming for yours. You know, in his experience in the South with his families, he had an uncle who was very much a gentleman and very wealthy, as well as another who was a distiller and a farmer. And he kind of had that rough education as well as that dignified, debonair education. And it kind of influenced a lot of him and some of the decisions, I think, and some of the decisions he made later as a president, and kind of saying, no, we need to open up land to the pioneers and send them out. And then you have, I need to look at her name because I don't want to mispronounce it. You have the Native American, Sarah, I think it's Winnemucca, a Powhatan Indian living in the Southwest. And for her, education was so much about paying attention to the cycles and the rhythms of the planet, of the environment that you lived in. The Powhatan Indians had a whole cycle of going from the mountains to being near the rivers to being, where they went. And it was all about how did you stay alive? And then education later in her life became about the same kind of theme. How do you survive? But because of the ensuing gold rush and the push westward, that changed into her questioning, does there need to be a necessary assimilation into white American culture for survival? And she really became isolated on both fronts because her people said, well, now you've forgotten your own culture. She married a white man. She learned how to read and write. But on the other hand, she wasn't completely accepted in white society. And she tried to start a school. For 4 years, she had a school going to teach cultural heritage to young Powhatan Native American Indians. But unfortunately, that too was then disbanded because of concern about the populations around her. So for her, what you needed to know was based on survival, but for very different reasons. John Kennedy, towards the end of the book, what do you need to know? Well, it seemed that at least the portrayal given by Daniel Wolff is something that he learned. It was that school was about connections. And the connections were how you made it in this world, how you could advance yourself and your money. And a very bright guy, apparently, John Kennedy, but the people who taught him kind of always said, but he doesn't seem to work up to his potential. I'm wondering where the shift occurred when he decided it was time to change that and see how he could make the most of himself. But a lot of the theme of his life, in fact, he said of himself, I didn't even realize that the Great Depression was going on. He was so insulated and kept separate from working class common reality that he was unaware. And then think about Helen Keller. It was education that allowed her to have the common experience of reality that so many of us who are sighted and can speak and can hear take for granted. You have this wonderfully articulate woman who said, when Annie Sullivan started working with her, at least I remember in the movie that I saw, she acted more like a little savage than a little person. And she said it really was the education, the words, that allowed me to enter into reality. So what do we need to know? It's a very different story no matter where you are. And one of the other things about this is it's interesting how Wolff really ties in, though. What I started to see through this is that what you need to know can't be separated from your history and your culture, even your circumstance. As you just mentioned with Helen Keller. What you need to know, or Sarah Winnemucca and the Powhatan Indians, what you need to know is intimately tied in with who you are and where you were born. So that can become, for me as a teacher, designing these kinds of experiencing, thinking about the debate we have now for education. What we need to know seems to often be one answer. We're all trying so hard to get to one answer, one thing. And I would argue that at least Daniel Wolff's work starts to say that's not necessarily the route to take. One answer is not going to cover all of the experience of what people need to know. You have Henry Ford, who spoke very highly of his education. In fact, he had one of the largest personal collections of the McGuffey readers of any other private citizen. But yet what he needed to know, he learned tinkering with machines outside of the classroom. And what he told you some people need to know is he said, well, it depends on who you are. There are those of us who are meant to be great, and there are those of us who are meant to work a factory for their entire life, and that's what they want. I don't know if I agree with that, but it does raise an interesting issue. What do we all need to know? How much can we normalize education? You know, you have gender issues as well. A really neat chapter was about Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife. And she was very highly educated for a woman at the time. In fact, she's the one, with John Adams, her husband, being away doing various political jobs and eventually becoming the president. She was left to manage and tend to their family estates. And so for her, something she needed to know was how to run these farms for profit and to make sure that they all lived. But then to compare that with other people who they needed to know how to farm for subsistence. Experience is so different. But she recognized, she often lobbied her husband, saying you need to make the system more equal for the education of women. And she was definitely someone that Daniel Wolff gives the impression that lamented the fact that she was not allowed formal education. Her grandparents, they spoiled her a little bit in the sense that they had a vast library and they gave her access to it. And they indulged her need to just read and read and read. And he also says that in her lifetime she wrote thousands of letters, an avid reader and writer, which is really a wonderful thing and informs how much of the education that she developed. But she saw at the time, what do we need to know? It's almost like she's saying, I'd love to know anything if you just let me go to school. And then you have Elvis, a product of formal education. But what he needed to know, he seemed to learn the most of in his Pentecostal church, in music stores, listening to the radio, but also his own experience, being born very poor and having an impression from his family that there was more, he needed more, he had his dreams and he strived for them and he accomplished them. So, what do we need to know? Well, I'm going to give you that answer after I take a drink. No, I'm just kidding. What I want to talk about now is something that further complicated the issue for me, was the story of education in itself. And this was kind of just something that I picked up on as I was reading the chapters. But there are two main people that Wolff talks about that were pivotal in helping to put formal education in place. One was Noah Webster. She recognized that name, at least the last one. And another was Horace Mann. Now, Noah Webster, I believe, this is going on tape, Joe, but I am going to qualify and say, don't quote me on this. But I believe Noah Webster was a revolutionary soldier. And what he saw in the aftermath of the revolution was that you have all of these people from different cultures speaking different languages and kind of sometimes getting along and other times not. And he really saw a need that we need a common language to bring us together as a common people. So he began his work of creating Webster's first little blue reader. But he also had the idea to shift it from being a religious-based institution to including one that was more patriotic. What I mean is, a lot of the Puritans in this country, they taught everyone to read because everybody should be able to read the Bible for themselves. That was the motivation. Noah Webster then said, but now we need to shift that and let's make it the stories of patriotism, the stories of George Washington, the stories of Thomas Jefferson, that wonderful image of crossing the Delaware by Washington, all of those things. If we get people to buy into our patriotic story, then we've got people who can buy into this idea of America. And for me, I looked at that and I went, oh my. So we were taking these rowdy immigrants and it was time to assimilate them and make them fall into line. And that seemed to be only perpetuated by Horace Mann, who, while these gentlemen, their hearts were totally in the right place, it seems. They wanted a formalized educative process for everyone. But a quote by Horace Mann, something that it seems like they said what they strived for was, and I'm going to misquote it, but paraphrasing, he said, train up a child in the way that they should be, and as they get older, they won't depart from it. It's essentially that same idea. If we make them who we want, that's who they'll be. In the chapter on W.E.B. Du Bois, they talked about why people in states started to argue for secondary education. Well, once again, every generation we have these influx of rowdy immigrants. And perhaps we need to keep those of us who are more upstanding members of society, educated, more obedient, separate from these groups of people. What better way than to create high school? But then in the parallel to that, contrasting it, in that same chapter, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, while that may have been the case, or didn't say that, but the impression was, while that may have been the case, he saw the incredible advantage to being educated. And he made sure that he consumed all that he could. He made sure that when they created that high school, he was part of it. And so did his mother, and so did other members of the community. But then again, he said that the race issue was thrust upon him early on. And it was that kind of informed a lot of his later work and his desire, saying that there should be a strong cultural component to education. And even when he later became an advocate of segregated schools himself, saying, though, that these should be equally funded institutions, but have a place where kids can go that they know they're wanted. So even he understood how important formal education is, but how incredibly nuanced that system can be, and how it can either help to propel you forward, or how sometimes it can be a block to you as an individual. And then interestingly, you go to one of my favorite chapters is the one about a slave from Ulster County, New York. In fact, she spent part of her time a slave in New Paltz. And at the time that this woman lived, there were about 2,000 slaves in Ulster County alone. Again, we can perhaps thank Noah Webster and Horace Mann for this version in our history, but the North had a significant amount of slaves, as the South did. It's a different type of slavery, tend to be more of house servants than plantation workers, but it was still present. And she would still, when speaking later in life, show the marks on her back that were given to her by one of her masters here in New York State. Now, he talks about this slave, and I'm reading it, not sure who this person is, where they fit into the story, until he gets towards the end. And he said that this person spent a lot of her information came from a celebration around the time of Pentecost called Pinkster Days, where African American slaves were permitted to get together, and really what it was a cultural celebration for them. And she received a lot of her education there of cultural identity and the importance of being who she was. And a lot of that showed her she was never satisfied with remaining a slave, and eventually she left where she was kept, and she went to New York City. And eventually, again, she thought it's time to switch. She decided she would become an itinerant preacher. And she walked away and changed her life and began her new existence as Sojourner Truth. And that moment gave me chills, because up till then I didn't get it. I was like, this is an intriguing story, but that moment, that woman, and she said, I never learned to read books. I learned to read people and nations. What she needed to know was how to be someone who could tell what your intentions were as a person and how she needed to navigate that, being an individual who was owned. Her greatest goal in life was to have her family be together. And the institution of slavery wasn't stable for that. Slave children had to be cared for, but was a long time before they were productive. So often children were sold. And so at the end of her life, she made enough from her autobiography and from her speaking engagements that she bought a house and she brought her family together to live there. A very poignant chapter in the book because of what it talks about with this whole thing. What does education mean? What do we need to know? So, after going through this process, I came away with some impressions as well as some themes that I thought Daniel Wolff was speaking about and how they could be utilized to inform our practice with education now. One of the impressions I got is that trying to make this one answer is nearly impossible. To create one value as to what education is supposed to serve in our society shouldn't be fixed and stagnant. Another impression that I got is that culture can't be removed from education. And this is a debate that's been going on for a while, but when you create one education, whose culture do you include? And whose culture creates the foundation for the learning? And in my own practice, that's given rise to so many different types of curriculums. One that I have some experience with, E.D. Hirsch's core knowledge curriculum. May have gotten that right. Again, it's on tape, so maybe you'll get angry letters saying it wasn't E.D. Hirsch. Noah Webster didn't fight in the Revolution. We'll have to see. But E.D. Hirsch's core curriculum, his argument was, you need to teach people the culture of the ruling class in order to give them upward mobility. Because if you don't, if people don't understand how to maneuver through the majority, how will they ever succeed? And of course, that's highly contested, debated. Some school districts believe in that. Others want to go more towards multiculturalism. We have to bring it all in, tell everyone's story. But it really starts to chip away at the idea that a national culture is what we need. A national culture and a national standard is the most effective. And I'm going to tread lightly because I might get myself in trouble. And you all know where I work. I might get my administrators in trouble. But I'm certainly not saying that we need to have schools that are made up, that are completely different where you go. I am in favor of national academic standards. But it becomes fuzzy, it becomes hazy. And I think this book speaks to that. You can't remove culture from experience. Education doesn't happen in a vacuum apart from our history and who we are as people. So one answer is not going to meet the needs of our nation. So let me go into some of the themes I think he was, at least I gleaned from these stories as a whole. Passion was certainly common with all of the people that he included in this book. And that was a little bit of the hard thing for me. I thought, you've got these wonderful Americans, but they made their name. They certainly aren't average American girls and boys in the sense of you live, you're productive, you love, you pass away, and nobody remembers your name outside of your realm of influence when you were alive. These are people like Lincoln, Henry Ford, Elvis Presley. But I think that was also something, this is how Brian Rhode learned to read. People would be less interested in it than how Lincoln learned to read. You know what I mean? So it's something that I think he needed to do. But these individuals were all passionate. And I think that you can pass on that idea of passion to everyone. Not only children, but cultures and families. If you want education to serve your children, and to serve your families, and to serve your culture, you need to be passionate about it. You need to be passionate about it as an institution. And that goes right into the other theme, which I think I gleaned from him, is that community and education need to be working together. What I see now in my practice is, and I'm not speaking specifically of my school, my classroom experience, but from working with other educators from the district as well as various districts, it seems that sometimes school is becoming more of a bureaucracy, a system that stands alone. And parents put their kids onto what they think is the conveyor belt that should churn out an educated child by the end of it. And there's definitely a detriment in that, because the first 4 to 5 years of a child's education happen in the home. And that's true for a lot of these individuals, especially the ones prior to formal education. Why did they learn to read? Because their mothers and fathers taught them to read. The motivations were all different, but so much of it was passed on by family members. And now we start to see more of a divide being created. And I think that is the characteristic of an institution when it's taken over by a government body. I think also necessary, but something we have to watch out for. When do we start to remove ourselves from the process as communities and families? Like W.E.B. Du Bois, he might get a letter about that one too. I don't know, Joe. But the church that he was a part of in Massachusetts, their community provided a place at one point for him and his very sick mother to live. Members of the community made sure that he was involved in school and enrolled in school. They helped him to continue his education. They helped him to make sure that he got a high school education. And then from there, they helped him to continue until kind of his own merits started to propel him forward. And there's a lot of that in other places. Sarah Winnemucca, interesting, one of Horace Mann's wife, Peabody, and her sister, the Peabody sisters, they took Sarah under their wing, and they really worked to try and help her with her cause of retaining the cultural identity of the Powhatan Indians. And that, again, too, she eventually published a biography. And I can't help but think that a lot of it was due to the Peabody sisters. There's a community that's involved with all of these people. With Elvis Presley, it's his church community. It's the Pentecostal church. And then the other folks who were singers, his own family, and supporting him. And I think we absolutely, and I feel like I'm preaching to more of the choir with people. We can't turn the camera and show more of the folks that are here. But I see a lot more head shaking say, yes, it was different 10 years ago. Right? 10 years ago. Not a day over 35, anybody in here. Which is a wonderful thing. But it was different when our children went to school. It was different when we went to school. And now we tend to have more of a micromanaged society, where education is the job of the teachers in the system. But I think that with all of this, education can't be a beacon on a hill. And this is kind of the most poignant idea that I took from this book, from my experience with it. Is that education, it seems like we have to get used to the idea that it's going to be a fluid institution. And that each generation, and within our cultures, we need to decide what end it's going to serve and what we need to do. Now, realistically, we have people who stay in their communities and start their own families there, and that's where they stay. But we have people who travel the world all over the place. So we do need to have a standard of education that will allow people to transition into other cultures, other societies, but perhaps with the same skill sets. But is it as easy as No Child Left Behind? Is it as easy as creating testing standards and making sure that that's what's met by everyone? Is it as easy when one system is created that kind of bolsters one cultural ideal? When what we seem to see through history is that education can't be split from that. I don't think so. And from this book, I got that impression as well. And it's something that I'm definitely going to take into my personal practice, which is very challenging to me because I'm an introvert. I call myself an informed introvert. I'm aware of my introversion. I know how to deal with it. But inviting people into my classroom to be more of a communal, cultural connect is something that challenges me very much. I like to sometimes close the doors. Interacting with children can tend to be easier than interacting with adults. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. But also, I really believed coming away from this that this is a direction to head in. This is the idea. We need to create this system together. We need to be involved in it together. So I'm not 100% sure what conclusion you can draw from this. In trying to cut away some of the red tape, it seems like this advice has some clarity, but in its application is still very complicated. But I really appreciated the lessons that I gleaned from How Lincoln Learned to Read and these 12 great Americans. And what I will say, too, is that if you pick up this book to read it, you may get a completely different impression. There's a wonderful portrait painted of each individual. He makes sure that he goes back and not only mentions them, but starts with their most significant influences in his mind, their family members. Annie Sullivan for Helen Keller, the Powhatan Indian culture, Andrew Jackson's family, where they came from as immigrants, and even the environment of being a teenager in the Revolutionary War, how that influenced him, which I really appreciated, seeing how it can round out a person's story. So you can pick it up if you're interested in history, pick it up if you're interested in education, perhaps pick it up if you're interested in both, and you might lose some friends, but that's okay. Not because they get angry, but because they finally realize what an outstanding nerd you are. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was informative. I hope it got you thinking, because it certainly did for me. And I want to thank Joe and thank the library for having me back. I'd be happy to come back again. So thank you so much. Thank you.
How did Lincoln learn how to?
What's interesting is he did have several years of formal schooling, but a lot of it was, I think, the typical fashion in which his mother and father were starting to work him through the Bible. And then, of course, his mother died from milk sickness when he was young. And then he ended up with a wonderful stepmother who brought books with her and really valued education. And she made it a priority to make sure that he was going to the local school. But I think part of it too was, going back to his passion, some of the stories about him, always with a book, a lot of his family members and society members thought that he was lazy because he was always reading. And so he did have some formal schooling, but it seemed like the passion of this man, education was inevitable. He's a self-taught lawyer and then involved himself in politics. So he did have some formal schooling. But I think enough to get him started, and then a lot of it he developed on his own. Could you strike that from the thing where I say he did it on his own and pointing at the opening teachers and job security?
No other questions? Oh, wait, hold it.
Was there any discussion in the Elvis Presley chapter about the Sputnik launch in '57, which changed education in the United States? I look around here, there were a lot of us were in school, or maybe some of you might have been teaching me, I don't know, but in '57 when the Russians launched Sputnik for the Soviets, they lost their minds. I mean, education in the United States just overnight went through this dramatic change, and that's the Cultural War.
Yes.
So is there any discussion of that at all?
There wasn't. Unfortunately, I can't remember. It wasn't front and center enough, so I'd say no. But it's interesting that you say that. There's a song by an artist. Oh, what's her name? But she wrote a song, and it's basically a story about an image of Elvis appearing on a farm, the side of a tin farm, and that people see it as a sign, and kind of like this hysteria that ensues with people coming to see this image of Elvis. And she talks about the people coming as the generation of the Eisenhower duck and cover years, and how then along came Elvis, the king. It was really interesting. And another thing that just happened recently was, a friend of mine who I saw last night, and he was talking to another friend of mine. He was saying, do you guys remember seeing that movie that they showed in school that was called The Day After Tomorrow? And I said, no, we didn't see that. But even how far it extended even to, this is someone who's younger than me, and he saw it in 5th grade. Parents all had to sign a permission slip, what would happen after the next nuclear war. So it is very interesting. And even now, sometimes even the debate, I think, of multiculturalism takes on a different kind of tone because of some of the cultures. Do we really want to include all cultures? It doesn't seem like all cultures are favorable to the American ideal. So I'm definitely not drawing a conclusion either way, but it's certainly, while they didn't mention that, I definitely appreciate your question and the influence that I saw with other things.
Well, you're way too young to remember those.
You had another question?
Yes, through a small bookseller in Albany, recently I became acquainted with a Canadian author, Robert Munch. And it was a somewhat mixed impression I got about education and about how people value things or do not value things. And he's written a number of children's books, the best one of which apparently is Love You Forever, which is very popular. And I recommend it to anyone who here has grandchildren or whatever. But some of his other books are banned from school libraries. Example of one is Pigs, or Pig, I'm not sure the exact title, and it's because of one incident in the book where a pig pees on the principal's shoes. And the reason given that it's banned from some libraries, school libraries, is that, well, they don't want that to set an example for kids coming along and peeing on teachers or principal's shoes. But the more, and then for that reason, this fellow, Frank Hodge, who's going to having to give up his bookstore because he just can't continue anymore. He hoped to continue until he's 90, he's 78 now. But he's having to give up his bookstore. But he said for that reason it's been difficult to use Canadian books. And how this question came about, or how that response came about, is in part I've been well impressed by a second grade teacher in Toronto who gave a wonderful seminar at Bennington College some years ago on Shakespeare in the classroom. And she does it extensively. She's written a number of books on different of Shakespeare's plays geared to the kinds of things she does in the classroom. And so that's kind of shut out. And perhaps the most telling example that Frank gave about Mr. Munch is that his one book it can get in the classroom, but by a ruse of the teacher, the principal, or the librarian who wants to do it. And this is called Naked. It's about a little boy and a little girl who apparently in the story picture book are naked. So what a librarian will sometimes do is use typewriter whiteout to put diapers on the kids, and that way it can get into the school library. But I think my basic question I'm leading to is if we get down to a question of values on the part of parents, people in community, and teachers that maybe interferes in some ways with really trying to get the kids about what's a value.
And I think that adds more, makes me think to respond even more to your prior question about what constraints do I face. Although, do you know what happens to the pig after he pees on the principal's shoes? The swine flu. You're getting a lot of letters on that one, John. Sorry. Well, to respond to that a little bit more, I think just to say you're right, there's an incredible, that is a lot of constraint. And I think I have a little bit more freedom as a classroom teacher because I'm not an administrator. And it's tough. I realize that there is a game you will have to play at every level. Hodgepodge Books, I remember seeing it, one of my first introductions to Lark Street was meeting Frank Hodge and just seeing this wonderful bookstore. So that's really sad that he has to close it. And it's tough because I think, again, my ultimate vision, I think, is to get people, children, and then through how to involve the community at some point, but to start to show people that there's a depth to issues and to life that you need to turn off the television and start thinking for yourself. Media consumption is so two-dimensional, and we tend to be influenced more by sound bites than we are by context. So that can be a firestorm. The kids are naked. But there could be a perfectly acceptable book where everybody's clothed, but they have a very hateful message. And because of the people who are in power are okay with it, they don't mind. You know? Like for me, kids might be naked in Robert Munch's book, but there's some books that I have issue with that tend to portray cultural ethnicities in a very stereotyped way, ones that are still used. And I have issue with that. I think that ultimately spurts more venom than a bunch of nude kids running around. But again, it tends to be about sound bites and what will infuriate people than substance. And so I guess my work is, I don't know what the constraints are. I hope that something that I've gone through this process is that I've realized already that I'm not going to succeed. But I hope to have the energy and the passion to get up every day, know that I'm going to lose, but to continue to work like I'm not each day. And to see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. You know, if it's an image of me being a lifer in first grade, it may be. But otherwise, I'm not sure. Ma'am?
Brian, how did you learn to read?
How did I learn to read? You know, I'm a product of the formal schooling system. I had an incredible, I had an incredible desire to. I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a family where literature was important. I had a book apparently that I would read, and people are like, "Oh, I'm amazed, he's 3 and he's reading," but it's because I had it memorized. And it was a book that had to be put away later because my parents were so sick of reading it to me. But education was really valued because my parents were both blue-collar workers at the time. And they saw, and they had that passion that said, we want something different for our children. And so we were pushed in school. You know, it was an expectation that we would do well academically. And then I think, through influence, through family values, and through the type of education that I eventually received, it became a passion for how does my position, what's the responsibility of my position now? For me, it's not about making money, because I wouldn't have become a teacher to do that. But I'm very fortunate to be one of those people who my occupation is an extension of myself. And that there are some days, I know this sounds cliched, there are some days that I'm like, they pay me to do this is wonderful. And there are some other days where I say, why, they need to pay me a lot more to do this. I always start my day with a side part, and then by the end of the day, I have people are like, why is your hair so funky? I'm like, it's not my intention, really. And I just have to say that my wife, who is also a teacher, she's home with our children currently, but she has informed a lot of this, the necessity for compassion and love, as well as professional practice. So I learned how to read through school, and I feel that it's the people in my life that taught me how to learn from what I would read.
Bites.
Sure.
In the East Greenbush School District, the first thing that they show in the manual is each child will come to school ready to learn. That's huge.
Yeah.
That's gigantic. It's 1 sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Each child will come to school ready to learn. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge statement. And then they go from there. And the other thing, having lived in Nassau for 30 years, if you're in Post-and-Kill and multiculturalism are not synonymous.
Right.
You're going to have to really expand your horizon.
Right, and that's something that I say, kids, don't you want to learn about Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Tubman? And they say, you talking about recess? I'm like, no, what do you mean? Well, the Lincoln logs are in the tub over there. No, just kidding. No, and that's part of my practice. I really hope that the children, after they leave me, and this is part of the basis of what I hope to do with this program, is to bring in, like David Wolff did, to bring in significant Americans of various cultures to help draw in, almost like this, but rather than learning, to draw in the values that are important. Just a short, very brief example, Cesar Chavez, in September, because mid-September to mid-October is Hispanic Heritage Month, and Cesar Chavez, of course, the activist in California who helped to lead a nonviolent protest for migrant workers to get more of a living wage. So yes, I recognize that, but the one advantage that we do have is we have socioeconomic diversity, which helps to bring up a cultural conversation, Exactly. A rich-poor divide, people who live in very large houses, people who live in dumps. Yeah, and it is quite a community. And so that is part of what informs my desire, because you're right, the lack of cultural diversity is what I think can sometimes perpetuate stereotype and prejudice by no meaning of the people. But if you leave the rocks unturned, you don't know what's there.
In a lot of cases, by the time you get them, it may be too late.
Right. So that's the time to step out and the challenge.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Darn it, it's on tape. I can't go back on it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.